Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Crowd Chatter Podcast. And today we got some more Bubble Watch videos coming for you. This is the first one you're seeing. Obviously, the first two probably are, well, they're all coming out at the same time. Uh, this is the first one you're seeing, of course. If you don't know, maybe you don't know what I'm doing, maybe you know what I'm doing, but have you ever seen the um, I don't know why I'm backing out. Have you ever seen the Bubble Watch video, the Bubble Watch stuff that ESPN does towards the end of the college basketball season? This is kind of my version of that. I kind of, I do all of what they do. I do different videos for the locks, for the should be ins, and then for the work to dos, it's kind of a similar thing. I do it a little differently than they do, obviously, because I mean, they just kind of put it in a whole article. I actually do videos on it. Um, but we're gonna get started on this one, and obviously this is always the most fun because this is always the category that everybody wants to see. Everybody wants to see work to do. Like where, you know, how much, where is everybody at in this category? Where is everybody, at this stage? Like where are the teams that need to, get some big wins to get them on the to get him on track, to get him on that, trail forward. And I'm going to start with the ACC. And the first team that I have listed is somewhere down here. It's an older look. There it is. NC State is my first team that I have. The Wolfpack of NC State is my first team that I have from the ACC. NC State, they have the thing working in NC State's favor is they do have a solid conference resume. The ACC conference resume, the conference record. I'm sorry, NC State's conference record is 7-4. Their overall record 15-7. Honestly, not too bad. In overall terms of those losses, they don't really have any bad ones. Ole Miss is a solid team. BYU is a solid team. Tennessee is a good team, obviously. And then in terms of their actual wins, I'm looking at the rest of their other losses. None of them are bad. In terms of their wins, that's where things get a little dicey because they don't actually have that great of a win. Their only really good wins are Virginia at home and then Miami at home. Other than really that, they have not beaten anyone, and maybe Wake Forest at home, and Wake Forest at home, yeah. But really, other than that, they don't really have a great overall win. And with the ACC being really deprived of big teams, other than Duke and North Carolina, of which NC State doesn't get to play either of those two again, as they already took North Carolina on once and lost. Their only their only shots left against either of those two will come in March. Will come in early March before the tournament, of course, where they get North Carolina on the road, and then immediately after Duke at home. Other than really that, their biggest opportunity left is Clemson on the road. They don't really have many other opportunities, which means they more or less have to be perfect, which is not a good thing for NC State because there's a lot of bad teams in the ACC that you can also lose to. Because there's certainly a top line, a middle line, and then a very bottom line. So that's the thing with the ACC. But NC State's a pretty good team. I got them here in work to do. I'm gonna go with my next two teams, pretty much because they're both gonna be right next to each other. Um, and that is both Virginias, Virginia and Virginia Tech. I'm considering as work to do teams. I'd have to double check their resumes since the last time I did both of them. I looked at both of them because they might have gotten like a better win since the last time I looked. Um, but both of these teams have had solid seasons. Virginia has had probably the better year. I think Virginia probably would be ahead of Virginia Tech. So I'll go with the Hokies first. UVA, the Who's have actually had a really good season. Their overall record is actually 17-5. You could consider them the other power in the ACC. With Duke and North Carolina really being the only other ones. So if you want another power, they're that. But Virginia, they're unranked right now. They're 17-5. They don't really have, I would say, a great win. They do have Florida and Texas A&M in a non-conference, which are both solid. But they also have a really ugly loss against Notre Dame, which is bottom of the ACC and 7-15. And and Virginia lost by 22. So that should tell you something. They also lost to Memphis, which is again a solid team. And then the actual conference itself, they really don't have a great win. I mean, they did beat NC State. They also beat Virginia Tech. But really, there's not much else to look at. And they just recently they did get just their biggest win in the conference, which was winning on the road against Clemson. An enormous win for them. They will have Miami coming up tonight, which is another huge game for not just them but also Miami. We'll get to them in a minute here. Spoiler alert. But that's going to be a very big one. That's a big one for Virginia. This is a solid team. It's a Tony Bennett-led team, which is almost always they're almost always pretty good. They do have actually. I didn't even realize they had this guy. They do have Jacob Groves, which is from a couple years back. Which from a couple years back was Eastern Washington's, tournament hero who I think did they upset Kansas? I don't think they did. I think they came close, but they ended up coming up short. And he ended up transferring to Oklahoma with his brother, and the two of them did solid for the Sooners. And now I guess he's now apparently a Virginia Hokie with who and Reese Beekman is still in UVA as a solid player for Virginia Tech, or I'm sorry, for Virginia. But the Hokies have a good team. Hokies. I keep saying Hokies. I'm going with the wrong Virginia. It's Cavaliers. Cavaliers. That's Virginia. The Cavaliers. I kept saying Hokies. Virginia Cavaliers. I am sorry to any Virginia fans. I am very sorry. I said Who's and I said Hokies. It's Cavaliers. The Virginia Who's, right? Please correct me if I'm wrong. I meant to say Cavaliers. If you're from Virginia and you're watching this video, I am very sorry. But Virginia 17-5, solid resume, solid record as well. I still have them as work to do though, just because they don't really have the greatest wins. Their best two are Florida and A&M, and then they have that ugly looking Notre Dame loss. They're in the ACC though, which just automatically makes it, automatically gets them in the conversation. They don't really have any big opportunities coming up against like really good teams until very late in February, of which they'll have North Carolina at home, which is huge, and then they'll soon in early March go on the road to take on Duke. Other than really that, their opportunities are pretty limited, other than their upcoming Miami game being really their only other opportunity to boost the resume of which they own. And speaking of, I mentioned the Miami, Florida Hurricanes. Here they are. Miami, Florida is the next team that I have here in the ACC for work to do. There's a lot of teams that are right here. I actually forgot to do Virginia Tech, so I'll go with the Hokies. Got it right finally this time. I'll go with Virginia Tech first. Their non-conference resume is okay. Is actually okay. Their non-conference resume is pretty good. They have losses to Auburn and South Carolina, but they also beat both Boise State, and then the huge one is Iowa State. Beating Iowa State is huge for Virginia Tech in the non-conference. They desperately needed that one. Getting that win was really big for them. They lost to Wake Forest. They did beat Clemson at home, which is a big win for them. That's a nice one. They also have NC State at home, which is another nice win for them. They did lose at home to Miami. They also lost at home, or they also lost to Florida State, as well as Duke. They just lost again to Miami, who now has a season sweep over them. So Virginia Tech has a decent record. Their conference record isn't all that amazing at 5-6. Their overall record honestly isn't that amazing either at 13-9. But this is really where you find a lot of teams. They have two easy games coming up with Notre Dame and Florida State, team games of which they really cannot lose. And then they'll go Saturday, and then they'll go next Saturday. The Saturday coming after this one, next Saturday. They'll go take on North Carolina on the road, which will be their first game against the Tar Heels. They already had one against Duke. May have another chance against Virginia, and that's really about it. So pretty much their only chances are going up against North Carolina and Virginia. So really, you see that, and that's really all Virginia Tech has. But solid resume, solid overall. I think they got a decent chance of going to the tournament. They obviously could use some more wins. The ACC, those don't come easy. So we'll see how that goes for Virginia Tech. Um, Next up here, as I said, kind of jumped the gun, but I do have Miami. Um, so I'm going with the Hurricanes here up next. Overall record is decent, 15-7. Their conference record is decent as well, sitting at about average 6-5. In terms of wins, Miami does have Kansas State. I guess you could say Georgia as well. I guess you could say Georgia too. Georgia's honestly not been terrible this year. They did lose to Kentucky. They got absolutely spanked by Colorado. That game wasn't really close at all. Um, and then you go to the conference. They ended up beating Clemson. And then things got a little dicey. They lost to Wake Forest. The really ugly losses, losing to Louisville, who sits also at 7-15, just like Notre Dame, who had beaten Virginia. Also lost to Florida State, which is really not a good team either. And really, other than their Virginia Tech wins, they don't have any good wins over anybody at all. But the big thing for Miami is they still have plenty of opportunities. They will have Virginia being the game tonight. They will have the Hokie or I almost did it again. They have the Cavaliers on the road coming up tonight. Then this Saturday, they'll have North Carolina at home. They'll go on the road to take on Clemson. They have Duke coming home to Miami. They'll go on the road later on to take on North Carolina. All those opportunities coming up here in the month of February. So huge chances for the Hurricanes to get some big wins and put themselves on the map for the tournament here in this month. They're I'd say on the outside looking in, um, but they certainly have a solid enough. But their overall record isn't too bad, and with some good wins, they definitely could get themselves into the conversation. Um, the next two teams are kind of like marginal ones because they don't really have a bevy of like outstanding wins. Uh, I'm still gonna go with this one though because they do have some considerable opportunities, and their honestly their overall record isn't too bad. This team finds themselves in this situation. I'm not even kidding. Like every season, I mean, they're almost always in this scenario. Um, you know, sitting right here every single season, and there they are. It's the Syracuse Orange yet again. We have Syracuse sitting in honestly decent position to go to the NCAA tournament. I mean, They have a they have a solid overall record. They have a sort of average conference record. They have some opportunities still coming up. They did just get walloped by Wake Forest, which doesn't look too good. But they have Clemson coming up soon. They have North Carolina coming up soon. They have Virginia Tech. They still have another game against NC State. They have another game against Clemson. They really need that North Carolina game desperately. Syracuse really pretty much has to win that one. But this team honestly is not in terrible shape. You look at their conference losses, I'm sorry, their non-conference losses, they're not bad. The Gonzaga one looked better at the time. It doesn't really that much anymore, but even Gonzaga is not a terrible team. Obviously, Tennessee is very good. LSU, they ended up beating. They lost to Virginia, not a bad team. Um, they beat Oregon, who is actually a solid team. They got that non-conference win, which will help them out in the future. And in terms of the conference, the Florida State and Boston College losses are not the greatest, but I've seen a lot worse. Those aren't going to be, quad four. Heck, they might not even be quad three. Um, they'd probably both be quad two, which honestly isn't bad for Syracuse. I think they're also on the outside looking in. But with some bigger games coming up, they have some opportunities. And if you're Syracuse, you need to make the most of them. Those will be big games for the Orange coming up. And then the next team, and this is finally going to be the last team in the ACC. Um, as I do this team next, this team will be the last one, finally. And that is going to be Wake Forest. I'm going to put them here. Um, they have a, they also have a decent conference record. They have a couple decent wins. As I look at the resume that they took some early losses. They lost to Georgia, lost to Utah, lost to LSU. But they ended up beating Florida, which does look good for them. Virginia Tech is a solid win. They beat Miami, which is a decent team. They beat Virginia, which is a decent team. Losing a hit doesn't look that special. A pit is not really all that special. Um, the record isn't that bad, but they did lose a pit, which is kind of unfortunate. They have a Florida State loss. They lost NC State. They just blew the crap out of Syracuse. Notre Dame, or I'm sorry, Wake Forest did end up losing in North Carolina, which was one of their big opportunities. They do have 2 shots remaining though against Duke, so they have both of those games still left. With a game on the road against Virginia still coming up as well. They have NC State coming to town. They have Clemson still coming in. They have a Virginia Tech game coming. So Wake Forest has got some chances. They're not the greatest team. I'd say they're also one of those teams on the outside looking in, but they have a solid record. They have they're definitely one of those teams you would classify as a bubble squad. Next we go to the Big 12, and I said the Big 12 was absolutely loaded with teams, and it still is, and it kind of remains that way. It's pretty much always been loaded. The first team that I'm gonna go with is actually in their last season in the Big 12. Now, there's only 2 teams. If you saw the latest one, you already know who it is, and that is Texas. The Texas Longhorns I have as the first team to be a work to do team. The Longhorns do have a decent resume. They, as you look at their non-conference, really, they don't have much of anything that really stands out. They lost to Marquette, they lost to UConn and Marquette, which were their probably 2 big opportunities. LSU's not a great team, which is the lone like decent team that they ended up beating. And then in terms of the actual Big 12. They're good. They have a solid amount of good wins. They have Cincinnati, Baylor, Oklahoma, and just recently they beat TCU. So those are all good wins. I have them listed as a work to do team. I would say they're on the right side or in the wrong side. Um, and I'd say that Texas is still decently comfortable, but the record is 4-5 now. They've taken some unspecial losses, with one of them being to a really bad West Virginia team. They also lost to UCF at home, which really is not that special of a team. Um, so those are some games that kind of are a little glaring, especially the West Virginia loss. They're really bad. I mean, West Virginia is 8-14, so that's definitely not a team you ever want to lose to in the Big 12. And with the Big 12, the thing about that conference is it's very forgiving because there are opportunities galore. You have so many chances to beat great teams. I mean, they still have Iowa State, Houston, Kansas, Texas Tech, Baylor, and Oklahoma all still coming up on their schedule. So, I mean, you got opportunities galore to beat somebody. So I like their odds. The next team that I'm gonna go with on here is in their first year in the Big 12, and that is the Cincinnati Bearcats. Kind of hard to see their logo because it's missing the red part. But Cincinnati is the next team I have on here. Their overall record is pretty good. You look at their non-conference; they do have a loss to Xavier as well as Dayton, and the rest of their non-conference was a bunch of nobodies that they beat, so not much to look at there. But then you go to the conference, and that's where things are looking up for Cincinnati. They beat BYU on the road. They beat TCU at home, which are both very good wins. They do have a loss to West Virginia also, which is pretty bad, but they also beat Texas Tech on the road. All those are very good wins for Cincinnati. Kind of in a similar position as Texas. I'd say that Cincinnati might have a few worse losses than Texas, which probably puts them a little closer to the cut line. And Cincinnati probably is straddling that line right now. But Cincinnati's in a decent position. I like the overall resume that they have, and as of right now, I'd say they're in pretty good shape. And then this next team that I have is in really big trouble, and I think they're playing tonight and what is a massive game for them. Yeah, they need some wins here rather quickly, but they're still in somewhat decent shape, and that's Kansas State. Last year they had an unbelievable season. Jerome Tang's team was unreal with Marquise Knoll and Keontae Johnson leading the charge. But now both of those guys are gone, and Arthur Kaluma comes in from Creighton to really be kind of like the leader for this team, and he's been solid, but the overall Kansas State resume is not all that sharp. They have a loss to USC, which at the time looked like it wouldn't be too bad, but USC has obviously fallen off a cliff since then, so that is a horrible looking loss. They beat Providence though, which does look decent for them. They ended up losing to Miami. They did beat Villanova and LSU, which neither of those really do much for them. They lost to Nebraska. Then you get to the conference, and their really only good win is Baylor. Um, they also, in terms of their other losses, they haven't lost to any really bad teams until just recently, where they took a rather not great looking loss to Oklahoma State, which is not a game you want to lose. But since Kansas State still is like many other teams has plenty of chances to make up for it. They have two shots against Kansas, one tonight and one in early March. They have another chance coming up against Iowa State. They'll have two chances against BYU coming up. Both TCU and Texas still remain on the schedule for Kansas State, as well as a Cincinnati match. So they have opportunities galore. Would beating would beating their arch rival of Kansas tonight on their home floor go a long way? Absolutely, it would. I think if Kansas State can win tonight, that would be not just a huge boost to their resume, but a huge boost to the team in general. After taking a rather after now being on a 4-game losing streak, losing to Iowa State, Houston, Oklahoma, and then Oklahoma State this past week, which is not a good loss. Um, I think winning that game would be a godsend for them. So now we go to the Big East, and I'm debating putting another team in this category. I don't know if I'm going to do it yet. I might add two more actually. I'm gonna stick with the first one I have, um, which is a pretty obvious one, really, with the season that they're having, and that is Butler. It's been a bit of a drought for Butler in terms of getting back to the NCAA tournament. But the Bulldogs have some good wins. They beat Boise State. They beat Texas Tech. They have lost to Michigan State and FAU, which are both decent teams. And then in terms of the conference, Butler has a win over Marquette on the road as well, which is pretty huge for them. They have some losses like St. John's and Xavier. But they also just beat Creighton, which is another huge win for them. So they got some good wins. I like Butler's resume. I think they're pretty close to that cut line. I'd say they're on the right side of it, that they'd just squeak in at this point. But they could use some more wins. They're definitely a solid team, though. Good resume. For Butler, they're looking like to be in pretty good shape. I'm looking at other teams. I know a lot. I actually ESPN. They're they have their own. I'm like blacking out on what I'm trying to say. ESPN has their bracketology thing where they kind of like predict what the tournament's going to be, who the tournament teams are going to be, and one of the teams that they have easily in there actually is St. John's, and I don't really know where that comes from because St. John's is 13-9 or 5-6 in the conference. They have a glaring loss to Michigan, which just is utterly abysmal at this point. In terms of like non-conference games, they don't really have any big wins. They lost to Boston College. They don't really have any big wins within the conference either. So I mean, I don't know what they're necessarily looking for there. I don't see it with St. John's. But the team that I think I am going to just slip in here, it's very marginal because their record really is not good. They have just a buttload of really ugly losses. Um, and so they really need to start winning some games here very quickly. And if they don't, I think they're in very much going to be in trouble. But I'm going to list this team as a very, very high maybe, and that's Villanova. This team, and this is going to sound weird because this team won Battle for Atlantis. Yeah, I mean, that sounds rather crazy, but Villanova won Battle for Atlantis. I mean, they beat Texas Tech, North Carolina, and Memphis to win Battle for Atlantis. They also have a win over Maryland in non-conference, but they beat all three of those teams to win Battle for Atlantis. This team is 12-10. And they have a lot of really bad losses. They lost to Penn, St. Joseph's, and Drexel, which are all just brutally bad. And of course, they lost to Kansas State. They did beat Creighton on the road though, which is a huge win for them. And in terms of the conference, they have lost to St. John's twice. They got actually swept by St. John's. They also lost to Butler. They just beat Providence, which is a good win for them. I'll list this team, but they need a lot of wins and they need a lot of them fast because their record just is really poor. With those three just ugly looking losses. I mean, they were all Big Five Classic games and they didn't win any of them. It just, to me, it's like, how does that happen? Like Drexel, St. Joseph's, and then 10. Like, you couldn't beat any of those teams, but you beat North Carolina, Memphis, and Texas Tech. Like, I don't get it. It's so random. They're a very weird team, but I'll list Villanova there. Like I said, very marginal, but I'll put them on there. They need to win some games rather quickly, but yeah, I'll list Villanova in that spot. And then the other team that I maybe would consider, but I'm not gonna put them on there, is Xavier, just because they've had a little bit of a hot streak lately. They have some opportunities still left to end the year, but I think it's kind of too far out of reach for them at this point. Next, we go to the Big Ten. The Big Ten, the first team actually that is going to be coming out of the Big Ten in terms of that's going to be on the list for the Big Ten is probably not one that you would ever expect. It's certainly not one I ever would have expected. If I hadn't been paying attention to basketball. Um, and this is probably the most random one if you haven't paid attention all year. The Nebraska Cornhuskers. Yeah, it makes no sense. I'm gonna go with the other one too because they're right here. Michigan State is the other one, but we're just gonna start with Nebraska. I'm pretty sure, obviously, everybody knows why Michigan State is going to be on there. I mean, they're in there every year. But Nebraska, this team had an unbelievable start to the season. I mean, they actually went the whole month of November undefeated. They went 7-0, and then they got massacred by Creighton and lost to Minnesota. But then they ended up beating Michigan State. They beat Kansas State, both of which are decent teams, so those are both good wins for them. And then you go to the conference for Nebraska, and Indiana's not a great team, but they beat Purdue at home, which is obviously an absolutely enormous win. They also got Northwestern at home. They lost on the road to Iowa, Rutgers, and Maryland. Um, but they did beat Northwestern and Purdue at home. They also beat Wisconsin at home in overtime. And I just lost to Illinois on the road in overtime. Nebraska has been dominant at home, other than their one Creighton dud, and has been utterly abysmal on the road. I think this team is barely in the tournament right now. If it were to happen today, Nebraska does need some more wins on the road, and they have a huge opportunity coming up against Northwestern on the road, which they really need. Because really, other than that, the Big Ten doesn't really offer much. The rest of their schedule is just pretty bad. They need to win every other game, pretty much. Nobody else is any good. They need that road game against Northwestern. Or road game against Indiana. That would be a nice one, too. And then the next one we have is Michigan State. And I think for most Spartan fans, they just are really disappointed by this year, especially because this team was ranked number 4 to start the season. And they were supposed to be, the creme de la creme. They were supposed to be, the best team in the country. I mean, they were supposed to be it. I mean, this team was expected to be better than all the rest, absolutely dynamite, and they haven't been anywhere close to that. Uh, you know, their first game they lost. They lose at home to James Madison, who in that at that point had only won their second ever, you know, top 25 game. James Madison hasn't gone on to have a really good season. But that's a game that you would think Michigan State would win. Then they'd lose at Duke. They did beat Butler, which is a big win for Michigan State. They lost to Arizona. They would lose to Wisconsin and Nebraska, but they did end up beating Baylor, which is an enormous win for them. And that one wasn't close. They destroyed Baylor. Then the other losses are really Northwestern. They fell short to Illinois. Lost to Wisconsin, which is a good team. I'll put them ahead of Nebraska here. Michigan State's resume is not doesn't have a bad loss on it, other than really James Madison, I guess you could say. But really, that even then, it's not really a terrible loss. Um, Not a terrible resume. I'd say they're definitely on the right side of the bubble. But they could use some more wins. Just be safe. You don't want to cut it too close to the you don't want to cut it too close to the vest, So they're in a good position right now, but some more wins would probably be nice for them. Now we go to the Pac-12, which I said before, which is pretty much in its last season. And the very first team I'm going with here is the Oregon Ducks. The Oregon Ducks are pretty much like a yearly work-to-do team. And they're in that position again this year. Oregon doesn't really have a lot of great wins. They lost to Santa Clara. They lost to Alabama. They did beat Georgia, which has ended up being decent for them. They lost to Syracuse. They really didn't beat anybody else there. Washington State's had a decent year, so that's actually a nice win for them. They ended up losing to Colorado and Utah. They also lost to Arizona. Just lost to UCLA. That's really bad because UCLA has actually been really ugly this year. Apparently, they've actually won a few more games lately, but it was actually above 500, which is wild because they were well below 500 at one point. Yeah, how many games have they won then? They must have won a bunch of them. Not Arizona State. Never mind. But Oregon's got they got a decent team. Um, and they have a decent resume. I guess UCLA's been a lot better lately because they won 3 straight. That's why. Because last time I looked at it, like well below 500. I guess they won a few games. How about it? But Oregon's in a decent position. That recent loss to UCLA is kind of harmful. Is really harmful. That's a tough loss for them. But Oregon's still in the solid position. They're still a decent team. They still need some more wins, but overall, it's not a terrible look for Oregon. Next, we're gonna go. I'm gonna stick with this one for now. I'm going with Colorado up next. The Colorado Buffaloes. They ended up their early loss. They didn't really beat anyone to start the year. They lost to Florida State and Colorado State, both of which are Florida State's not really that special, but Colorado State's pretty good. They did beat Miami, Florida, which is a nice win for them. That was no blowout. They beat Washington State, who's a solid team. As I said, they beat Oregon. They lost to Washington State the second time, though, that one being on the road. Could not beat Arizona. In fact, that one wasn't even close. They ended up losing to Utah. They'll have another shot against Arizona coming up on Saturday at home. That's a game they have to have pretty much. They really need that one. But Colorado's in a decent position. Is definitely on the outside looking in. Some more wins for are probably needed. And then the next team is probably not a team you'd expect to really ever see. as they're normally always terrible for basketball. But that's Washington State. And the Cougars are actually playing decently well. Their record is pretty good at 16-6, so not a terrible record at all. And early in the year, they lost to Mississippi State. They beat Boise State, which is pretty good. Santa Clara's a decent team. They're not really that great though. It's not the greatest loss. Also got destroyed by Utah and did not beat Colorado the first time. Like I said, they beat the second time. They have a win over Arizona, which is a huge thing for them. They do have an ugly loss though against Colorado, or not Colorado, against Cal, who's a pretty bad team. They did destroy Utah the second time. And then they barely beat Washington. So I'd say they're in a decent position. They have another win. They have another chance against Arizona coming up. That one will be on the road. They definitely could use that one. Other than that, they do have a chance against Oregon on the road as well. So a couple chances for Washington State really still left. The only other team that you could say maybe has a shot here. And actually, I think I might actually list them. Assuming they don't have any glaring a lot of really glaring losses. Um, yeah, I'll put them on here. All right, so I got one more for the Pac-12. I'm adding this one late just because I recognize a couple things. I reckon I put Utah State for should be in. I'm doing Utah now for work to do. The Utah Utes have a okay resume. Um, they have a win over Wake Forest. They have a win over St. Mary's actually on the road as well, which does look good for them. They also beat BYU, which is a huge win for them. Their early Washington State win looks nice. They lost to Arizona State, which is not the greatest team. Um, but they did end up they lost to Arizona State, who's not a great team. They also lost to Stanford, who's not a great team. They also lost to Washington, who's not really that great either. So those are a lot of really bad L's. But they did beat Oregon. Like I said, they beat Washington State early on. They lost them the second time. They did beat Colorado too. So they have a chance coming up at home here against Arizona. That's a game that Utah desperately needs to kind of get their season on because they don't. The Pac-12 is not very forgiving. You take an L in the Pac-12 and it sinks to your bubble resume. So Utah really needs to win this game at home. It's been where they've been outstanding all year. They have yet to lose at home. So is Colorado, but they have yet to lose at home. Utah does, and they can beat Arizona at home. It would be just enormous for the Utes and really their overall chances. So I'll list them as work to do. And that's all I got for the Pac-12. So now we go to the next conference, which is the SEC. Now this is an interesting one because we got a couple decent teams. The first one for me is pretty easy. I'm actually jumping them ahead a little bit. I'm gonna stick with them for now. I'll flip around if I need to actually later on. But first, I'm gonna go with Texas A&M. This is a team that was expected to be dominant to start the year, and they really just did not end up being that. Um, A&M really kind of struggled all season. I mean, when they started the year, it was really not all that sharp from the Aggies. I mean, they did beat Ohio State, SMU, Penn State, but then they would lose to FAU. They did beat Iowa State early on, which is a huge win for them. They did lose Virginia though, right immediately after. They also lost to Memphis and Houston. I mean, they're both good teams, but not ideal L's. Then you get to the conference, and they did lose to LSU. They lost to LSU at home, which is not great. They lost to Auburn. They did beat Kentucky at home, though, which is an enormous win for them. They lost to Arkansas, though, which is not a great team. They lost to Ole Miss, which is a decent team, and then they just beat Florida, which is a big win for them. So they're right on that cut line, I would say. I mean, they have an average conference record with a 13-8 overall record, which isn't really horrible. Excuse me, which really isn't horrible, but it's also not really amazing. So another decent win for A&M would be advisable. The next one here that I have is Florida. They've had a bit of a nice run here towards the end. That's gotten them higher up in, I would say, this mix here. Early on, Florida took an L to Virginia and Baylor, as well as Wake Forest, all of which are decent teams. None of them are bad. They were close in all of them, except really the Wake Forest one. They lost that one by 11. And then their other non-conference games, they did not lose to any bad teams, so they're in the clear. They fell just short to Kentucky in the first matchup, which was at home. They lost to Ole Miss, Tennessee. They did beat Mississippi State and Georgia. And then they had their huge win over Kentucky in overtime, and then they just took an L to Texas A&M. That Kentucky win for Florida is enormous. They desperately needed that. Now they'll have a home game coming up, actually, this Saturday, where they will take on the Auburn Tigers. Another huge game for the Florida Gators. They could use that one. I would say they're also pretty much right on that cut line of in and out. They certainly need a big win coming up here pretty soon. They could use that big win. Is what I'm saying. Next, I'm gonna go with I'm whiff waffling between two teams. I'm gonna go with the first one here because it's just where they are. I'm gonna go with Georgia. Now, Georgia's not in the best of positions. I'll go with the team after them that I think is in a bit better of a position because Georgia really just did not beat anyone in the non-conference other than Wake Forest. They also beat Florida State, but Florida State's not good. You get to the conference for Georgia, and they don't really have any great wins other than on the road against South Carolina. That one's really good, but they really just have not beaten anybody else. I have them on here, but they need some big wins coming up here very quickly because they're running out of time and they're also starting to run out of opportunities. So they need big wins and they need big wins fast. In fact, well, they already played Kentucky and they lost that one, yeah. So Georgia really needs some big wins soon. They're on the outside looking in. The other team I have from the Big 12, or not Big 12, the SEC, is Mississippi State. The Bulldogs, the thing for Mississippi State that really is keeping them out, I would say right now, is their incredibly poor non-conference, or I'm sorry, incredibly poor conference resume. Because their conference record currently is 3-6, which is pretty abysmal. They also have an ugly loss in the non-conference against a unimpressive Southern team. And no, the conference is literally called Southern University. So yeah, that's really bad. They did beat Washington State and Northwestern, though, in the non-conference, so both of those wins do look good for them. And they also have two conference wins against Tennessee and Auburn. But they've lost to Ole Miss, they lost to Alabama twice, they lost to South Carolina, they lost to Kentucky, they lost to Florida. So their conference record is terrible, but they do have a lot of good wins. So it's like a balancing act between, their conference resume is terrible, but they have some bad teams coming up. I mean, they're up next against Georgia. the Bulldogs right here, so the other Bulldogs. So I mean, that's a big game for both of them. That's a bubble tanking game almost pretty much. That's a big game for both of those two teams. Then Mississippi State will have Missouri and Arkansas. Those are a couple games where they can get their their conference record up. So they win all three to go 6-6. And then you get to the meat of their schedule where they get Ole Miss, Kentucky after they get Ole Miss, LSU, Kentucky, Auburn, Texas A&M, and South Carolina. All those are huge games. So opportunities galore for Mississippi State, but they need to get their conference resume or conference record up. It's in the basement right now, and it definitely needs to be a lot higher. And I don't think that's really any question. They have to get that conference resume or conference schedule or conference. Yeah, my gosh, they definitely have to get that conference record up very quickly because it's not in a great position as of right now. Um, Next, I'm gonna go to the others category. We're done with the SEC, so up next we go to the other, just kind of miscellaneous section here. Um, I think the first team I'm gonna have to go with, which is this is gonna be an odd one, because you wouldn't expect me to put this team here, but I'm gonna have to go with them. I would almost consider making them a should be in team, but they have some bad losses I can't overlook. I'm going with St. Mary's. I think they're I'd say they're on the right side of the bubble right now. They have a very good record at 18-6, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure that's what it's at right now. Yeah, 18-6. They have a win over New Mexico, which is a very good win, of course. They did lose a Weber State, though, so that obviously is kind of glaring. They also lost to San Diego State and Xavier. Neither are really very close. They did lose to Utah as well as Boise State. They did beat Colorado State, which was a big win for St. Mary's. But they also did lose to Missouri State, which is again a bit of a glaring loss as well. So you have those two glaring losses with some decent wins early on, and they have yet to lose in their conference. They are on currently a 10 game winning streak. They have not lost in their conference. And their latest win just came on the road against Gonzaga. So that tells you where St. Mary's is right now. It's looking pretty doggone good. And that was the road game. They haven't even played their home game against Gonzaga yet. So St. Mary's is in a very good position. Um, and then with the next one, I'm gonna go with the Lone Mountain West team that did not make the should be in cut, and hard to really see it, but there it is. That's Nevada. The Nevada has a very good overall record as they sit at 17-5. In terms of their non-conference record, I'm sorry, non-conference. In terms of their non-conference schedule, they honestly did not really lose anybody other than Drake, which is not the greatest. Again, not the greatest loss. Drake isn't terrible, but it also is not the greatest look. Nevada did beat TCU in a neutral site. Huge win for Nevada. And then you really get to the conference. They did beat Colorado State. They lost to Boise State, San Diego State, New Mexico. They lost to Wyoming as well, which is the kind of uninspiring loss. Their overall conference record is 4-4. They're in decent position, but they need some more wins, and they need them quick. As it's looking a little bit bleak for um, for the Nevada Wolfpack. I believe it's the Wolfpack for Nevada. And then for our last team coming out of this others category is right on the bubble, and you would never expect to find them right on the bubble considering their recent history, and that is Gonzaga. Yep, the Gonzaga Bulldogs are actually a team that's on the bubble this year. They're honestly their record is okay. I mean, obviously it is, I mean, obviously that's exactly where you'd find it. It's at 16-6. Um, they didn't win a lot of their big non-conference games. They lost to Purdue. Their Syracuse win is okay. They beat USC, not any good. They lost to Washington, which is not very special. They lost to UConn. They lost to San Diego State at home. They lost to Santa Clara on the road, and they didn't lose anybody else in the conference other than St. Mary's. So you take that into consideration. They have a really random road game against Kentucky. So that game is absolutely enormous. They have to win that. I mean, Kentucky doesn't, but Gonzaga really needs that game, which is really strange to see a random non-conference game in the middle of their conference schedule. But they really need that game at Rupp Arena. They have to win that. Otherwise, I think their chances are pretty much gone, and they're staring down the barrel of trying to somehow find a way to keep winning games, while hoping that just something happens in front of them, because their only other team in their conference that's anything worth talking about is St. Mary's, and they don't get them until March. So a rough position for Gonzaga. And that's going to do it for this video. So I hope you guys all enjoyed it. First week of Bubble Watch. As I was saying in one of the other videos, these videos will probably go way quicker because now the first week is over and done. And now with this week being over, I can kind of just go over the teams and keep them where they are if I believe they should stay where they are and all that. So that's it for me, though. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. So until then, adios, everyone.